All right, in this section of chapter 31, we're going to be talking about the economy and society during the Roaring Twenties. It should go much faster than the last section. All right, so if you look at this graph right here from 1921 up to the Great Crash of 1929, this shows that the GNP grew exponentially. As a matter of fact, it's believed that the economy grew at about 40% during the 1920s. Much of that growth had to do, well, there were several different factors, a variety of reasons. One was post-World War I. So World War I, the United States geared up to produce all these different implements for the war. And then afterwards, many different new products were needed, not only here in the United States, but also in Europe. So they were producing all of these new products for home consumption and home use, and there were new inventions that were spurred by that. But also the policy that was put in place by the government was intended to help sort of speed up that production. So you could see this historically. Again, if you look at, you go to Hamilton, you go to Henry Clay with the American system. This is another guy, Andrew Mellon, kind of had a plan for the economy to move along. So he was the Secretary of the Treasury from 1921 until 1932. He served under Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. These are the presidents that were in between Wilson and FDR, right? He was highly regarded until the stock market crashed in 1929. There really wasn't much that he had to do with that, but people after that, they wanted him to do something, and he thought that the government shouldn't get involved in it. So anyway, he was extremely wealthy. The Mellon family was. They were bankers and businessmen, and he had a hand in just about everything. So he had a shrewd mind for business. But anyway, after World War I, what he wanted to do was balance the budget, and he wanted to reform taxes. So they maintained the progressive income tax, but he cut the taxes, not only on the wealthy, but across the board for all income brackets. He also reduced the national debt substantially. So here are his plan, the four components of it. Cut the income rate for the top tax rates from 73% to 24%. So you look at that 73%, during World War I, Wilson raised taxes significantly. We're going to look at a chart here to pay for the war. And then those were dropped down to 24%. So that's lower than the tax rate that we have today. Also, for the lower income people, they only paid 4% of their income to taxes, and that went down to just 0.5%. So there was a tax cut across the board, but it was much more significant for people who were wealthy because they paid such a significant portion of it. And he believed that that was going to stimulate the economy. It's a trickle-down economic belief, right? He cut the taxes. He also wanted to reduce the federal estate tax, so cut those taxes as well. An estate tax, sometimes they call it a death tax. So this is something that is of issue for my in-laws. My father-in-law is a farmer. He's in his 90s, and he wanted the farm to stay in the family, but if he died and just gave it to my brother-in-law, then my brother-in-law would be burdened with all this debt, because on paper they look like they're millionaires, right? But they are very small, hardworking farmers in southern Illinois. So what they've been doing through the course of probably 30, 40 years is that my brother-in-law has been buying the farm. So it doesn't look as if he just gets this windfall profit. So if though somebody was a billionaire and they died, and then everything went to his children, then that would be an estate. And then so presumably you'd have to pay a tax on that. Well, Mellon wanted to reduce the amount that people would have to pay. He also wanted to make government more efficient, right? So it's a typical sort of Republican agenda. We're going to cut taxes and make the size of government smaller, more efficient, less bureaucratic. So as I said, he did lose some support after the Great Crash of 1929, because when he was advising Hoover on different things, he didn't think that the government should really intervene in the economy. He thought that it would work itself out. When we get to the Great Depression, there's debate by some historians and economists if government intervention exacerbated the situation or helped it. So we'll see. Okay, so this is the marginal tax rate ever since the income tax was imposed with the 16th Amendment. So you can see right there during World War I, taxes increased significantly, going up right here, right? So this is Mellon in through here. This is where they cut taxes from 74% down to 24% on the wealthiest. So the orange line indicates the maximum that people have to pay. And then down here at the bottom, this is for those people who pay less in taxes. So they went significantly lower too, right? So he cut them there. Now, when Hoover is president and the Great Depression hits, he is going to raise taxes here. So it goes up to like 63%. And then FDR is going to raise them even more significantly. So there's a big debate. What if they hadn't raised taxes during the Great Depression? Then would people have been able to invest in their businesses, have hired more people rather than lay them off? So there's where the debate lies. Okay, another thing, if you look to the right here, this is a ticker tape. These guys, there's information coming out of this little ticker tape, and they're reading their stocks. A lot of people played the stock market during this time, and they're always watching whether the stock is going up or down, right? So a lot of people invested in stocks than ever before during the 1920s, right? When prices rose, then people would sell their stock, and when you want to buy low and sell high. And so people were playing this game, and some people were becoming very, very wealthy. The only thing is, it was also where you could buy on margin. So let's say you bought $10,000 worth of stock, you only had to put 10% down. So you'd get $10,000 worth of stock, but you only had to invest $1,000, and then you'd have to pay on that $9,000. The only problem with this, if it rose from that, you could sell it off, you could pay off your $9,000, but then maybe you could bank who knows how many other thousands. The problem with this is that the stocks rose faster than their value. So when it crashed in 1929, people might have a whole bunch of stock, but they're worthless. And not only that, they're out their initial investment and how much money they owe for these worthless stock. So everything just kind of, it just washed away. All right, one thing too about the economy, and as I said, it is booming in the 20s, and one of the reasons for this is because of this rapid production. I think it grew, I told you, by 40%. It's actually up here, it says 42%. But anyway, so it grew. The United States is producing all these industrial goods, not only for the US, but also elsewhere. You can see over to the right here, they are assembling a car using the assembly line process that's taking place there. So there's a lot of technological advances, right, for new consumer goods and mass production. Also, we're getting ready-made clothing. Food is being processed and it's ready-made, it's canned. There's all these new electrical items that are being produced as well, and appliances and everything else. And so there's just kind of production and production and production. Eventually, though, the market's going to be saturated, and this is going to be a problem that's going to help to lead to World War II, as well as the stock market crash. But anyway, also during this time, there's good wages, right? People spent money on all these goods, but also the government spent money on roads, on stoplights, on stop signs. They had to do all these different things. There's investment in real estate. People are taking vacations. There's new forms of entertainment with the film industry. There's just so much going on. So these good wages they have. But there's also, in 1919, there's a whole bunch of strikes. Those are put down, and really labor can't really get a foothold, because if you look at this, it's kind of the same problem they've been having for years. If you've got this huge labor supply, right, and if somebody is not doing their job, they can just be fired and you can hire somebody else quite easily. Another thing is you had this huge influx of immigrants at the same time, and because these people are from different countries, they often don't get along very well, or they can't speak. They might get along, they just don't know it because they can't understand one another. So there's a lot of ethnic diversity, so it's difficult to get people to come together to unionize. So that's problematic for union. Also, these people who are, I don't know, I don't want to say Native Americans, but people who are American citizens have to compete with these immigrants coming into the country. And so a lot of people, labor doesn't like that either. But anyway, so that's why there's slow growth for working class solidarity. It's because it's a large, culturally diverse workforce. Okay, so here are some of the products that are being produced during this time, and I think that you could probably figure all of them out. Top left, of course, that's an oven and a stove. These are kind of popular. Some people like getting them today, retrofitting them to, or new ones into the kind of popular farmhouse motif that people have going on. This right here, you may not know what this is, whoops, but that's a washing machine. So this part does the washing, right? And then you can wring it through the wringer right here. You'd have to put your clothes up there. You got power tools. This right here is a refrigerator. The whole component of it that the condenser, whatever it's called, is on top. I remember my grandparents had one of those back in the 1970s. You've got, this is a space heater. This right here is a telephone, right? A waffle iron, you can tell that. This right here is what you would use at the dentist. So the dentist would have that. And then this is an iron. You can't see it because my head's in the way. All right, but probably the thing that encouraged the economic growth more than any other item at that time was the automobile, right? This was the most important new industry for this economic growth. And most historians would say that this is what sparked the third industrial revolution, the first being textiles, the second railroad, third the automobile, and now they say we're in the fourth, and that of course is technology. But anyway, they used the assembly line to do this. Now, the gasoline-fueled engine was created by Benz, Carl Benz, and well, actually, I think it went back before Benz. Benz converted it to an automobile. So Mercedes-Benz, right, that automobile company. But anyway, they started to commercially produce a motor vehicle using that internal combustion engine. Henry Ford, he is the one that took that. He created Ford Motor Company, and he started using assembly line techniques with the internal combustion engine, and he started mass producing automobiles. Other companies follow. By 1910, you can see here there are 69 different companies producing automobiles in the United States. This sparked the creation of all other businesses, just like the railroads. When the railroads were built, you needed the railroad, right? Well, here you need the road. You need the restaurants along the road. You need stoplights. You need glass, rubber, all these different things for the automobile, right? It also had significant impact on American lives. For women, it gave them a lot of freedom because they didn't have to depend on men the way that they had to before, right? So women were more independent. It also gives teenagers and people privacy too in an automobile. And this is during sort of a sexual revolution that went on during the 1920s. People would use it for leisure time, for going on vacation, for moving to different parts of the country, school consolidation, right? Law enforcement used the automobile. People start moving out to the suburbs, and here you can get there easier, right, by driving out there. But also people who were involved in crimes also use the automobile. Okay, so the Model T, this is very interesting. If you look at it, this chart over here, the length of time the average American employee had to work to purchase a car. So Henry Ford had this notion that if you pay your workers well enough and you bring down the cost of the product, then your workers would work fewer hours and they could buy the product, right? And this was during a time too when people could buy on credit. So the Model T, it was very cheap, it was extremely rugged, The price was very reasonable and it was reliable, right? So they're producing this very efficiently using the assembly line method. And so what happens is the price goes down and then more and more people could purchase it. By the end of the 1920s, there were 26 million cars registered. And for the first time, see, when the cars first came out, they were just toys for the very rich. But then the average working man could own a car, and then also women got behind the wheel and women could own cars as well. All right, so here, buying on credit, you can see this right here. Easy terms to buy this car right here. You have to have certain month down, and then what was it? This one's 73 pounds, so this must be from a British advertisement. But the one to the right, you could buy a radio, Kent radio, General Motors radio, $4 down, $36.50, or different payments. That might have been annual payment. So buy now, pay later. Americans kind of started the whole credit movement. Originally, people didn't like that because they thought it showed weakness and it wasn't good consumer skills and that sort of thing. But then it kind of came the wave of the future. All right, so here's Henry Ford, talks a little bit about him. He grew up on a farm in Michigan. He didn't like being on a farm. He didn't have a formal education, but one of the things that he cherished the most is he got a watch, a pocket watch, and he liked tinkering with that. And then he started tinkering with other people's watches, and people went to him to get them fixed. And then he went and worked as a mechanic in different fields, kind of tinkering with different mechanical things, including the steam engine on their own farm. And he thought that the steam engine was too big and bulky for lighter vehicles. And so he started to toy around with the internal combustion engine. And then he started Ford Motor Company, right? And he's credited with Fordism, that mass production of inexpensive goods, right? Not only that, the way that he organized his business, we talked about this during the Gilded Age, where you had Taylorism, where you manage your business scientifically, where you get rid of waste and it's structured with this hierarchical structure. So he employed that. And so he was a shrewd businessman. Later, what we're going to find out, well, he opposed World War I, and many people think that he had Nazi, I don't know, maybe sympathies, because leading up to World War II, he was anti-Semitic, and some people think that that might have even led to the Nazi Party movement in Germany, because he was a huge worldwide figure. Ford cars were being sold worldwide, mostly in Europe and the United States. Okay, so advertising in this new consumer age, it became big too, a new business, right? So they're starting to sell new products and trying to coax people into believing that, oh, this old style fashion thing that you have is no longer stylish. You need and you want something new, right? So a way of sort of selling things. So Bruce Barton, this guy, he was the founder of the New Profession. He wrote The Man Nobody Knows, and he said that Jesus was the best ad man of all time, right? Oftentimes, though, the advertising wasn't always truthful. If you look right here, boy, I'd love to get my hands on some of that. Wash away fat and years of age with a soap. Imagine that. Here, they're appealing to men, leisure, talking about tobacco. They're advertising that. This one, I took a class talking about advertisement during this time period, and oftentimes it would be appealing if you had a cook who was black, then you have made it, right? You were wealthy. So black people were in advertising to try to sell things to make you appear to be more elite. You could get Uncle Ben's rice and Aunt Jemima pancake mix, right? Those two name brand products have been around for a long time, but they were used to sell products. All right. Here's some interesting products, right? Boy, the way that they would treat kids. And then my computer went off. I think my battery's low. I like the kitty coop, but what about that baby Alice thumb guard? You just put wire on there, and presumably your child's not going to suck on that. The kitty coop looks like a cage. I guess you can just put it in there and wheel it around. All right, sports too became big business. Part of the reason for this is because you could listen on the radio to baseball games. They were being, you get in real time sort of baseball games being announced and boxing matches too. Somebody'd be in the sidelines kind of saying what was going on. Two heroes and two big sports figures. You got Babe Ruth up here at the top for the New York Yankees. And then Jack Dempsey. He was a world heavyweight champion from 1919 to 1926. He was the son of an Irish immigrant and Native Americans. So he was a national celebrity because of he was a boxer. Okay, the airplane industry was another new industry that literally took off, right? The Wright brothers tested the first flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903. World War I, though, too, kind of sped up the development of them because in World War I planes were being used. And then the post office started to use it, and then it was legalized by the Kelly Act of 1925. We get the first transcontinental flight that goes from New York to San Francisco with the mail in 1920. And then there's the Air Commerce Act. Congress authorized commercial airlines. This was in 1926. And then from 1926 to 1929, the number of people flying in planes increased significantly from 6,000 to 173,000. There were a lot of these returning pilots from World War I who were barnstormers. They would kind of go on shows and show people what they could do, where they do crazy antics. They would storm barns, they'd fly through barns, or maybe have somebody standing on the top of a biplane or something like that, or roll, and people would pay money to watch that. Probably the greatest hero, at least for a while, in 1970 or 27, was Charles Lindbergh. So there was a contest going on where they tried to see if anybody would be willing to make a nonstop flight, a transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. So he tried this out. He specially equipped and rigged this plane they called the Spirit of St. Louis, and he flew it from New York to Paris in 33 hours, 39 minutes, right? That's quite a feat. It was just him in one plane. They wanted to make it as light as possible so they wouldn't put glass in there. So he had this device to be able to see in front of him. They concocted some sort of thing where he could go to the bathroom. I mean, they thought everything through. So he flies from New York. He flies into Paris with huge fanfare. All these people are waiting there for him, and he was a worldwide sensation. Here is a picture of Charles Lindbergh standing by the Spirit of St. Louis. I'm not sure if it's the real thing or not, but I think it might be a replica of it that is hanging in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. But anyway, he was in an auxiliary corps of the Army Air Corps as a pilot, right? And he had also flown airmail. He was an airmail carrier prior to that very historic flight. When he made the flight, he receives not only the Distinguished Flying Cross, but also the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's the highest award you can get by Congress. In 1932, though, he had achieved this celebrity status. His baby, a 20-month-old baby, was kidnapped and held for ransom. They paid the ransom, but then the baby was found dead in a grave from a head wound. This German carpenter was tried for the crime and electrocuted. Shortly, everybody was very sympathetic to it, but then some people kind of say, well, maybe he did it. They start looking at him as being the culprit because as World War II is coming up, he does have sympathies for the Nazis, and he's a member of the America First Committee, which was a group of people who were opposed to American intervention in World War II. So some other changes were occurring in education as well, right? Many states had imposed rules that education was compulsory up until at least the age of like 16. And so this really took away the problem of child labor, right? That many people had been trying to address for many, many years, Florence Kelly and others, right? Also in education, there was all sorts of new scientific research and discoveries were being made. One of them, sometimes it was because of donations that were made by these very wealthy people. As an example here, the Rockefeller Foundation, through the research in that organization, they ended hookworm because of all this scientific data and things that they've been finding out about germs and viruses and everything else. Starting to see anyway, life expectancy increases throughout the United States during this time. And then we have talked about him before, and your book has him a couple of different times throughout, but John Dewey, he advocated for this notion of pragmatism, that knowledge is fallible and you must constantly research and discover different things because you're going to find stuff out. So anyway, he applied the principle of that to virtually all aspects of life and philosophical concerns of the day. And he wrote about various social issues in publications, and he became a very noted, I guess, sociologist and psychiatrist of the time. But when talking about education, he really encouraged it would be very important to teach children how to learn for a lifetime, that they should educate forever. You can't just assume that you know something and then move on in life. Okay, so another significant event that occurred in America during this time period was the Scopes monkey trial. What this was, it really it illustrated the changing American society, and it also demonstrated that there was this growing fundamentalism within the United States, right? So Charles Darwin published his Origins of the Species in 1859, which said basically that animals, including humans, evolve through natural selection. And so Tennessee passed a law known as the Butler Act that said that teachers could not teach this in school. The reason for that is it challenged creationism and what is taught in the Bible. So the American Civil Liberties Union, an organization which had only been around for maybe 10, 20 years, it wanted to challenge this law. So it was looking for a science teacher who had taught evolution in school and wanted that person to be fined so that they could challenge it. Well, one person, John Scopes, worked in the Dayton, Tennessee school district. There's some confusion here, at least on my part, on what exactly his role was. Some cases say that he was a substitute teacher. I've seen other instances reading it where he was a science teacher, but he didn't teach biology. I think that the video that you're going to watch says he was actually the football coach, but he was subbing as the biology teacher, and he taught a section about evolution to the class. So he says, yes, I've done it. So then he was fined. He was in jail. He paid the bond, and then he goes to trial because they're gonna challenge it. Well, William James Bryan, you remember him, the Cross of Gold speech. He was a devout Christian. He'd also run for president twice. So he says he volunteered. He wanted to serve as the prosecuting attorney prosecuting Scopes. And Clarence Darrow, he was a founding member of the ACLU and a very famous lawyer at that time. He was about to retire, but because of the publicity and the importance of this case, he says, okay, I'll do it. He was going to be the defense attorney, right? So there was all this publicity. You know how the media likes to just kind of pile on. So they all go to this really small town in Dayton, Ohio, and it just becomes a circus. It was published, or it was broadcast on the radio throughout the country, so everybody knew what was going on. They were tuned into their radios everywhere. Well, anyway, it got kind of heated. They debated all sorts of different things: creationism, evolution, the Bible, the Constitution. The judge kept trying to remind everybody, we're just here to see if he violated the law or not, right? But they were debating a lot of other things. So Clarence Darrow gets William James Bryan up on the stage or the stand, and he's asking him questions about the Bible. Do you believe that Jonah really lived inside the belly of the whale? And so William James Bryan kind of had to admit that not all religious dogma was factual, right? So that was kind of the high point of it. And then William James Bryan's debating his closing arguments, but he really wouldn't get to give them. Well, he didn't get to give them because he passed away in his sleep before that happened. Scopes was found guilty and charged $100. But later, this was appealed to the Supreme Court of Tennessee, and they ruled that the law was constitutional. But as I said, it showed this growing fundamentalism in the United States at that time. Okay, so the radio, as I say, I was telling you, a lot of people start listening to the radio, right? We're not, people debate who actually invented it. They've been playing with radio waves and all sorts of things for many years. But generally speaking, Guglielmo Marconi gets credit for it. But nonetheless, it was used during World War I for various reasons, and then it was first broadcast here in the United States in 1920 when Harding won the presidential election by a landslide. So what it did is it gave people the opportunity to communicate over long distances. People advertised on it. There were commercials, there were shows, there was entertainment. I remember my grandma, she used to watch this show, As the World Turns. It started out as a show, it was a drama where you just listen in on the radio. And then the commercials that they would have appealed to women, and it would have like laundry detergent or I don't know, dish soap or that sort of thing, or soap for your baby. And so those were advertised at the time that women watched, and so these were called soap operas. And then they turned over and they were on television. I remember my grandma ended up watching that show too. She listened to it on the radio and then she watched it on TV. So this was another industry that just expanded exponentially. And by 1925, as you can see, there were 5 million homes that had radios in there. I think that this picture here is really funny. So you had earplugs where you could plug in and listen, right? And so this one was like, you want some bread? I just think it's a funny picture. Okay, here are some radios, and you can see how they changed over time. 1922, 1924. That one looks a lot like the one that those two women had. 31 and then 42. 42 must be, you can carry it with you. It's mobile. Okay, another new industry was the film industry. These films over here, at least the ones on the top, the Lumiere brothers, we've seen those in class. We've also seen the Jefferson ones. The Great Train Robbery, this was 1903. That was the first narrative film, so it kind of told a story, but it was a silent film. And then we've talked about Birth of a Nation. This was the first sort of epic film. It was also a silent film, and this was in 1915, right? So those are some of the first films. But then we're going to get more films. The first one with sound is The Jazz Singer. So you can see the billboard, the poster for it. The guy was Al Jolson, who was a jazz singer, and the story goes like this. Jazz was very popular at the time, but he was a young Jewish boy, and he wasn't supposed to like jazz, right? Well, he wanted to be a jazz singer, so he wore blackface and performed on stage, right? From this, we're going to get all sorts of movie stars, and once we get a common language on the big screen and on radio, then the English language is going to become more standardized. So initially, the first films were pretty risque. This woman over here, her name is, which one is she? She's Theda Bara. There was also Clara Bow. So these two women are known as vamps because there were these vamp films where it was pretty risque like that, and it showed a lot of skin, and so people were pretty critical of that at that time. So what happened is that the film industry started to regulate itself. But let me go back to the top. The film industry during World War I was regulated by the government. Originally, a lot of people were using the film industry for things like this or to coax people into socialism or communism. They were for pro-labor sort of movements. But then we get a group of businessmen, entrepreneurs like Adolf Zukor and the Warner Brothers, and they started to expand the industry. They took it out to Hollywood and they commercialized it, and so it changed as a result. But as I said, they self-censored because of the public outrage from images such as the one on the right here. So Theda Bara, she is in this film, she plays a homewrecker, right? And it's in a movie called The Vampire. And so from that, those sorts of films with the dark eye makeup, the loose woman, that sort of thing, those are called vamp films. They're short-lived. Okay, so changing society. Let's go ahead and get through this. So one thing that changed is people continue to move into the cities. So if you go back to colonial times up through the through Civil War, even further, more people lived in rural areas than they did in urban areas. But you can see right there by about 1910, 1920, more people were living in cities than they were in countries for the area in rural areas for the first time, right? You can see here in the 50 years from 1870 to 1920, urban population increased from 10 to 54 million. A lot of that had to do not just with migrants moving from the countryside, but populations moving into the United States from other countries. So there were problems associated with this, right? And I put some down here. Crime was a problem, filth was a problem, dirt. Sometimes you'd get epidemics of cholera, things like that. Funding the police was difficult. And then, of course, at this time, they had to arrest people for violations of prohibition. Right. Also, a big change for women was the flapper. So women, young women especially, they challenged the Victorian era, and they started to embrace lifestyles that were quite different, and they really started to push that envelope socially, economically, sexually, throughout this time period. Right. Originally, the term flapper came from Britain. It described girls who had not yet matured to adulthood. In the United States, they say that flapper came because your boots, you didn't tie them all the way, and so they flapped when you walk. I'm not sure which one is correct, but this one, this one epitomizes it. She has a bobbed hair. She wears a loose-fitting clothing, right? The dark eye makeup and that sort of thing, showing some skin. It wasn't just your appearance either. They acted much more like men. They smoked, they drank, they danced, and they were sexually active. It was a different time period. What the books say, it's sex o'clock in America. So some people say that when you can look at the arguments, there's quite a few different reasons why women evolved the way that they did. More women entered the workforce. They were still stuck though. There were like 25% more women had entered the workforce during World War I, and then shortly thereafter. They were still stuck in those low-paying fields, right? They hadn't really busted through that yet. But then they also got the right to vote, and they were empowered by that. The jazz age kind of lent itself to this new freedom with that music. And the behavior of that. Also, Margaret Sanger and her efforts at birth control, and the automobile, which provided a lot more freedom for women. Okay, so we've talked about Margaret Sanger before. She challenged something known as the Comstock laws. These were laws that said that you couldn't transport anything in the U.S. mail that was lewd or lascivious. This included material that could teach women about how to prevent pregnancy, whether it's the use of prophylactics or information about menstrual cycle or something like that. She was inspired to try to aid women in their reproductive health because her mother had 18 pregnancies. She bore 11 and she died very young, right? Margaret Sanger herself was a New York nurse. She worked on that. What she's most noted for is that she started family planning, right? The organization Family Planning. We've discussed in the past that she was also a eugenist, and she wanted certain people sterilized, including African Americans in the United States, and she stuck to that. Through her efforts, though, the birth rate did decline, right? The average number of children in 1900 per family was 3.5, but through the knowledge that some people gained, people credit her for passing that on, the rate went down to 2.3 children. Right. She also worked tirelessly to raise money for the birth control pill. And in 1930, they'd isolated and determined the structure of the steroid hormones and ways of inhibiting ovulation. And then the pill was used, or it was approved for consumer use by 1960. Okay, so I had mentioned about the flappers and being sexually active. This was a time period in the 1920s where there was a lot of sexual promiscuity, and they kind of swung one way, and then everybody was so sort of mortified by it that it sort of ended with this decade, at least temporarily until the 1960s. But during this time period, young people would have something called petting parties where you kind of get together and I guess make out and that sort of thing. Some people attribute this to the fact that there's more people living in cities, so there's looser morals. The flappers and their notion of being free to do what you wanted to do as a woman. Also, prior to Prohibition, men and women did not sit and drink together at bars. But with Prohibition, they did at speakeasies, and this was going to continue a social pattern after the 1920s, right? Young people during this time period too had a lot more freedom. They had leisure time to kind of coddle in movie theaters or automobiles. And also one thing that would encourage them is at the time there's a well-known neurologist and psychiatrist, Sigmund Freud, an Austrian, who said that all human activity is driven by sexual desires. So it kind of equated that with, well, we're only being human. Okay, so this was also the Jazz Age. This was a musical style that started among African American communities in the South. You could probably even trace it back to plantations during slave time, but it evolved into a much more upbeat, improv sort of music under musicians like Jelly Roll Morton, Joe King, Oliver, and others, right? And it really took off in New Orleans, and then it moved up the river to Chicago, and it became very popular there. And from there, it spread to other locales, right? And it kind of became part of this Harlem Renaissance as well, just a flowering of the Black culture. But some would say that it was the music of the era. White people took that music and transformed it into more of like a white style. Paul Whiteman is one example of that. There's some links here that you can click on to see both styles. Okay, and then in literature, there's the lost generation. This is a term given to a group of writers who really were dissatisfied and disgusted by American society that had become so materialistic. And so they were critical of that. They said it was cold and impersonal, right? So they're disillusioned by that, and they wrote about it in various works. And here are some of them. F. Scott Fitzgerald, of course, you know him from The Great Gatsby, right? He talked about, his writings in the Jazz Age. He wrote short stories too, usually the themes of youth and the promise along with despair of the age. And then E. Cummings, he was a poet and a painter, 2,900 poems. Here's one, or geez, at least a thought. To be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight and never stop fighting. I thought that was appropriate. All right, and then Ernest Hemingway, he was kind of known for his stylish ways and being a sportsman and that sort of thing. He was somebody that a lot of people looked up to. He kind of just did his own thing. He wrote short stories, but also he's known for some of his novels. Some of them I have here. The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, and For Whom the Bell Tolls, Old Man and the Sea. So usually it's stoic men who show a lot of grace under pressure. And then Sinclair Lewis, interesting stories here, like Main Street, a woman who rebels against the provincial life in small Midwestern town. William Faulkner, he's kind of epitomized a Southern writer at the time. He wrote stories that kind of had a setting in a Southern town, much like his own Oxford, Mississippi. And then there's changes in architecture too. So instead of the Greek revival that had been so popular throughout our nation's history, there's a switch um, to different architectural styles. We've talked about Frank Lloyd Wright before, right? Something kind of builds from the site. You know, its form or function follows form. But then there's Art Deco, which is very popular. Here is an image of the Chrysler Building, and you can kind of see that Art Deco style. It's linear symmetry, bold lines, and that sort of thing. Empire State Building, built during this time too. Carbide and carbon building. And then if you go to the historic district of Miami, you see a lot of Art Deco buildings down there. Miami really flourished during the 1920s. There was this huge real estate boom, a lot of people going down there, including Al Capone. And then here is Wall Street in 1920s too. It looks very similar today, actually. So with Wall Street, there's speculation that's going on. Real estate is being bought on credit. The stock market's soaring at this time, but the deficit is really bad, 23 billion. And some people want some fiscal conservancy, right? And they're debating Mellon's policies, right? And then, of course, we're going to get the stock market crash. But anyway, and then agriculture during the 1920s. This is important to note. It sets the stage for the Great Depression because farmers had continually gotten into debt as they're buying more and more equipment, right? And they're producing more and more crops. So there's going to be a problem. They have a lot of debt, and the price of the farm commodities has gone down because there's such a glut on the market, right? So this is very problematic. So the stage is set for catastrophe with the Great Depression. Here you can see a Massey Harris. I'm not sure what that is. I think it's just cutting it. It's a reaper. But anyway, so they're doing that. Also, the South was hit, as I told you before, by the boll weevil attack in 1925. Okay, this was a little bit shorter, not too much. Sorry about that, folks.